Hi, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. It's all happening. The gang is all here with you on a history-making afternoon. Just so you're aware, and in case I rudely interrupt any of the brilliant minds we've assembled to talk us through the next 2 hours, in a matter of about 10 to 15 minutes, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg is expected to address this newly unsealed indictment of the twice impeached, now indicted ex-president Donald J. Trump. It'll be the first time we hear from him since Trump turned himself into law enforcement this afternoon. We will bring Alvin Bragg's remarks to you live as soon as they begin. While we wait, a lot is happening at this moment, including developments in just the last few minutes. We now have our hands on the actual indictment, and it's a doozy. It has just been unsealed. People are still going through it, processing it. It has just been made public. You can read along with us if you want to. Importantly, it includes 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election. We understand, thanks to our NBC News colleagues there in the courtroom, that it was Trump himself, in his own voice, pleaded not guilty today. The former president is right now on his way to LaGuardia Airport. He's going to take off in his plane, fly to Mar-a-Lago, blah, blah, blah. Prosecutors this afternoon shared with the judge a number of examples, though, of online threats that have been made by Trump in the past few weeks in order to make a case that this type of hostile rhetoric could spoil a jury pool, among other things. Reading this indictment along with us, we have New York Times investigative reporter Susanne. She's been covering Trump and his finances for years and helping us understand what we should be looking for. She's over there with her pen. I can't wait to hear what she's underlined. Former FBI General Counsel Andrew Weissmann is back. He's been with all of you. We've all been listening to him all afternoon. He investigated Trump during his work on the Mueller probe. John Heilemann is with us for the 2 hours. He's executive producer of Showtime's The Circus and host of the Hell and High Water podcast from The Recount. Former Florida Congressman David Jolly's also here. Lucky for us, they're all MSNBC contributors. I was going to say unlucky for you, David Jolly. He's heading to Florida, to your home state. But let's focus on what Alvin Bragg has done, what Alvin Bragg has kept secret, what Alvin Bragg successfully kept secret really until Donald Trump was inside the courtroom, Andrew Weissmann. And that is, I heard you say it first, 34 felony counts of falsifying business records.
Yeah, so one thing that's very interesting in the speculation before we knew these charges was that he would charge some misdemeanors and some felonies. And here, this is a bold indictment. This is 34 felonies. There are no misdemeanors. The people who are saying, is it appropriate for a former president to be charged with a misdemeanor, which, by the way, it should because he's not above the law, that's no longer an issue. These are 34 felony counts, which is, kind of remarkable. As far as I can see, there are 12 general ledger charges, 11 checks that form charges, and 11 invoices. It's a little unclear how they got there, to be fair. It's not required when you plead something. You can actually just plead the actual language of the indictment. This does go further than that because there's an indictment, and that has that sort of stripped down, just pleading what the charges are. But then there is a lengthy statement of facts. But it's unclear exactly what the theory is as to how they got to the felonies. It appears that at the very least it is election crimes. It may also be tax crimes because there are allegations about that. And they definitely go out of their way in the statement of facts to over and over again talk about the evidence that Donald Trump was focusing on the election, that this was not a sort of how do we keep this from Melania Trump. And there seems to be quite a lot of evidence of that, clearly the DA was concerned about that and is making it clear in this document that they're going to be, the felony bump will at least include campaign charges, and they obviously will have evidence that they present to a jury. It'll be up to a jury to decide whether they think that's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So this seems like a very bold indictment in that it is all felonies and 34 of them.
Sue, I've asked you about the IRS as though you have a direct line to them at the end of the day.
I call them and they don't call me.
I think by the end of this, there may be a reason for that. Let me just read the introduction of this because it invokes the legitimacy of our questions about the IRS off the bat. The defendant, Donald Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. There's your campaign-related crimes. From August 2015 to December 2017, the defendant orchestrated a scheme with others to influence the 2016 presidential election. This is language, Andrew Weissmann, importantly, that is almost verbatim what SDNY described Donald Trump's role to be. They use the words coordinated and directed, but same evidence. He did so by identifying and purchasing negative information about him to suppress its publication and benefit the defendant's electoral prospects. In order to execute the unlawful scheme, the participants violated election laws and made and caused false entries in the business records of various entities in New York. The participants also took steps that mischaracterized, for tax purposes, the true nature of the payments made in furtherance of the scheme. So it sounds like more than, or maybe in addition to witnesses, this was a document-reliant investigation.
Right, and we don't yet know how that's going to be charged, if it's going to be. But normally when you falsify business records, there can be reasons that you do it for not tax purposes. But in this case, it just didn't make sense that they're falsifying a business record and then not having it sort of flow into the tax arena. Donald Trump could have just cut this check out of his personal account and it would have, he could have called it a day. They decided to bleed it into the Trump organization. And then it becomes, so what did they do? And you can see when you go into the indictment, they look at the arrangement that Michael Cohen made with Alan Weisselberg, who is the former CFO of the Trump organization, now sitting at Rikers Island for other issues. And it says here, the Trump organization CFO and lawyer A, being Michael Cohen, agreed to a repayment of $420,000. And this is like an umbrella payment to Michael Cohen. They reached that figure by adding a $130,000 payment to a $50,000 payment for another expense for which lawyer A also claimed as a reimbursement. So they go through this, but then they gross it up, and it says here to the Trump organization's CFO then doubled that amount to $360,000 so lawyer A could characterize the payment as income tax on his returns. And that's where it gets to the crime, as though it wasn't what it said. And then they put it onto so it could, Michael Cohen could then use it for income on his returns. You
and I were on television together with Michael Cohen when, ahead of Weisselberg's sentencing, when this question of grossing up payments came up. And the sort of the black box at that point was whether it had, as you just described, whether it also led them to lie on their taxes about where that money had gone. It appears this goes some distance in answering that question.
Yeah, and I always think when you look at a tax return, even when you file your tax return, there's a box where if you've received a bribe, you have to check it so that
I use that every year.
So they can either come after you and arrest you for the bribe, or they've got a record of it if down the road.
You have to pay taxes on it.
Yeah, you got to pay taxes on it, and then they'll come and get you.
That's amazing. Is it like near the tips box? That's amazing.
But this is sort of a piece of that. I mean, he had a hush money payment. It was an illegal fee, and then it flowed through onto a tax return.
I want to just say one thing about what's on our screen, not related to Donald Trump, but related to Alvin Bragg, who really is the man of the hour. He's creating charts and graphs. He has the intention to graphically do some of the storytelling for us non-lawyers. Andrew Weissmann, what do you expect? And this is just a remarkable thing to see. Let me just stop on this board. Someone had to go to a printer and have something printed that says "People versus Donald J. Trump." The country's last president is now a criminal defendant facing 34 felony charges.
I was asked earlier today by Katie Chur a similar question about raising in court the concern about the danger to the judge and to the district attorney and their families. And you really have to step back. There's just the unreality of seeing something that says the people versus Donald Trump. We may soon see one that says the United States versus Donald Trump. And the idea that this is not an organized crime case where you're worried about the safety of the DA, the judge, the jurors, the grand jurors, the witnesses. This is the former president of the United States. I mean, I was on the special counsel investigation. I understand that about threats that were made. It still is breathtaking that you're in this situation, and reading something that is both tawdry and scary at the same time. And the final thought I have is, I know a lot of people say this is a sad day, but I know that for the DA's office, they're viewing this as the sadness is the fact of sort of this disgrace of the presidency. That happened long before today. And this is really restoration of the rule of law in light of what had happened.
John Heilemann, I want to bring you in. I want to apologize ahead of time because it is highly likely they'll have to interrupt you. We've been given a 2-minute warning that DA Alvin Bragg will start. But we'll spend some time on this, not in the aspect of how Trump and his new TV lawyers framed it. But in terms of what Andrew Weissmann just said, that because of our reliance on norms in our politics and because of their complete and absolute failure to protect any institution from Donald Trump and the bleep storm that he ushered in, we had a surreal conversation between prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys with the judge about the climate. Is that the right word for it? The conversation being fueled by Trump.
Yeah. And look, it's, Andrew used the word, I heard him say it earlier, he said breathtaking. And he said it again just now about the fact that that's the kind of conversation you're having, and that Trump has so often been analogized to an organized crime figure, to a mobster, to behaving in those ways. To see now in a formal legal setting exactly the kinds of conversations taking place and exactly the kinds of protections being necessary for jurors that you would have seen in cases that Andrew prosecuted way back when in the Eastern District against the Gottis, the Gambinos. It makes it not metaphorical anymore. It starts to feel much more tangible in the context of a judge issuing the kinds of stern, we don't know exactly what he said so far. We have to get more reporting about exactly what those exchanges were, but the way in which it's being characterized is being taken very seriously, as of course it should be. I'll also say one other thing about this, as you read this document. Andrew makes the point that there are some real questions, and hopefully DA Bragg will be asked them about trying to tie together some things about how he gets to federal, how he gets to, here he comes.
There comes a point when a singular event shapes our future, broadens our perspective, and marks a crossroad in our cultural landscape. The Turning Point, an original documentary series from MSNBC Films and executive producer Trevor Noah that explores these watershed moments for the biggest issues of our time and asks how we got here and where we go next. The Turning Point documentary series on MSNBC and streaming on Peacock.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. Earlier this afternoon, Donald Trump was arraigned on a New York Supreme Court indictment returned by a Manhattan grand jury on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Under New York state law, it is a felony to falsify business records with intent to defraud and an intent to conceal another crime. That is exactly what this case is about. 34 false statements made to cover up other crimes. These are felony crimes in New York State, no matter who you are. We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct. The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records. He also caused others to make false statements. The defendant claimed that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. This simply was not true. And it was a false statement that the defendant made month after month in 2017. April, May, June, and so on through the rest of the year. For 9 straight months, the defendant held documents in his hand containing this key lie, that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. And he personally signed checks for payments to Michael Cohen for each of these 9 months. In total, the grand jury found there were 34 documents with this critical false statement. Why did Donald Trump repeatedly make these false statements? The evidence will show that he did so to cover up crimes relating to the 2016 election. Donald Trump, executives at the publishing company American Media Incorporated, Mr. Cohen, and others agreed in 2015 to a catch and kill scheme. That is, a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election. As part of this scheme, Donald Trump and others made 3 payments to people who claimed to have negative information about Mr. Trump. To make these payments, they set up shell companies, and they made yet more false statements, including, for example, in AMI, American Media Incorporated's business records. One of the 3 people that they paid to keep quiet was a woman named Stormy Daniels. Less than 2 weeks before the presidential election, Michael Cohen wired $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. That payment was to hide damaging information from the voting public. The participant scheme was illegal. The scheme violated New York election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. The $130,000 wire payment exceeded the federal campaign contribution cap, and the false statements in AMI's books violated New York law. That is why Mr. Trump made false statements about his payments to Mr. Cohen. He could not simply say that the payments were a reimbursement for Mr. Cohen's payments to Stormy Daniels. To do so, to make that true statement, would have been to admit a crime. So instead, Mr. Trump said that he was paying Mr. Cohen for fictitious legal services in 2017 to cover up actual crime committed the prior year. And in order to get Michael Cohen his money back, they planned one last false statement. In order to complete the scheme, they planned to mischaracterize the repayments to Mr. Cohen as income to the New York State tax authorities. The conduct I just described and that which was charged by the grand jury is felony criminal conduct in New York State. True and accurate business records are important everywhere, to be sure. They are all the more important in Manhattan, the financial center of the world. That is why we have a history in the Manhattan DA's office of vigorously enforcing white-collar crime. My office, including the talented prosecutors you saw at arraignment earlier today, has charged hundreds of felony falsifying business records. This charge, it can be said, is the bread and butter of our white-collar work. And fraud presents itself in all different forms here in Manhattan. We have charged falsifying business records for those who violated federal bank secrecy laws. We have charged falsifying business records for those who were seeking to cover up sex crimes. And we have brought this charge for those who committed tax violations. At its core, this case today is one with allegations like so many of our white-collar cases. Allegations that someone lied again and again to protect their interests and evade the laws to which we are all held accountable. As this office has done time and time again, we today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. No amount of money and no amount of power changes that enduring American principle. I'll now take questions.
Right. So we're going to take a limited number of questions. There are no follow-up questions. One question per reporter. I will call on you. And again, we have limited time. Thank you. The first question will be Rick.
Thank you. Why now? I think some argue that this is a political move. You're not going to be a political person. If we're going to go into
We conducted a thorough and rigorous investigation, as we're known to do, at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I've been doing this for 24 years and am no stranger to rigorous, complex investigations. I bring cases when they're ready. Having now conducted a rigorous, thorough investigation, the case was ready to be brought, and it was brought.
Mr. Bragg, the indictment says that there were 34 false business records. And they were done to conceal another crime, but the indictment does not specifically say what those crimes were. We are assuming, perhaps, that they might be election-related. I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
Right. So let me say as an initial matter, the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require. In my remarks, I mentioned a couple of laws, which I will highlight again now. The first is New York State election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. I further indicated a number of unlawful means, including more additional false statements, including statements that were planned to be made to tax authorities. I also noted the federal election law cap on contribution limits.
But why weren't there those crimes charged? Why weren't we charged with those crimes?
Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence in the law is the basis for those decisions.
Hi, Mr. DA. You had expressed a year ago that you had some reservations about the case's readiness. Can you talk to us about what were some of the questions in your mind that needed to be answered in order to bring a case of this magnitude?
I'm not going to go chapter and verse into any thinking. What I will say is, I believe the time period you're talking about, I've been in office for a couple of months. The investigation, in my view, was not concluded into the conduct in particular that is the basis for the charges today. Since that time, we've had more evidence made available to the office and an opportunity to meet with additional witnesses. So as I said earlier, I've been doing this for 24 years. I don't bring cases prior to a thorough and rigorous investigation. Now, having done so, the case has been brought.
Mr. Bragg, Garrett Haake with NBC News. Your predecessor took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Federal prosecutors took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Do you believe you have new evidence that led you to decide to charge this, or why now?
Well, as I just mentioned, we have had available to the office additional evidence that was not in the office's possession prior to my time here. And as to your part of your question about the federal, we have a distinct and strong, I would say profound, independent interest in New York State. This is the business capital of the world. We regularly do cases involving false business statements. The bedrock, in fact, the basis for business integrity and a well-functioning business marketplace is true and accurate record keeping. That's the charge that's brought here, falsifying New York State business records.
Yeah.
Thank you. DA Bragg, I'm just going to read back one line from your statement of facts. The participants also took steps that mischaracterized for tax purposes the true nature of the payments and furtherance of the scheme. Do you allege former President Trump was one of the participants who mischaracterized the payments for tax purposes?
I'm not going to go beyond the plain language statement of facts, which I think speaks for itself.
Shana? Brad, can you please comment on the strength of the evidence that Trump personally intended to violate state election law through the actions that are charged in the indictment? So
the charge is falsifying business records. The charge requires, as I specified, criminal conduct that was concealed. One of the concealed crimes we allege is New York State election law. I sort of went through, and our statement of facts, which I think many of you have in front of you, goes through things including, text messages, emails, contemporaneous phone records, multiple witnesses. All of that will be, as you saw in the fall, borne out in a public courtroom in downtown Manhattan.
Last question is Jonah.
So, DA Bragg, the charges related to the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, the release from your office also mentions another woman, Karen McDougal, as well as a doorman. Can you comment on how those players are related to the charges you've brought or to the case overall?
I'm glad you put your finger on that, because it's not just about one payment. It is 34 business records, 34 false statements in business records, and we're concealing criminal conduct. And the earlier question about New York State election law, when I talked about conspiracy to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. Those unlawful means, we allege, include the conduct set forth in the statement of facts, which is additional false statements separate and apart from the charged ones in AMI documents, planned false statements to taxing authorities. It is not just that one $130,000 wire payment. Thanks so much.
Mr. Bragg, any comment about any incitement of violence by former president?
At what point do you think that word?
We've been listening to District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who has made history today by charging twice impeached ex-president with 34 felony crimes. I want to make sure I understand this. I've got the support system to do just that. What the DA is articulating, that basically it's the cover-up in addition to the crimes that got Donald Trump in so much criminal trouble, that over the course of 2017, and the district attorney made a point of ticking off the months in April, May, June, for 9 consecutive months, he made a hush money payment in installments, and that the business records were falsified in each and every instance. There's been a lot of banter, frankly, some of it goes over my head, about what the crime is that beefs this up to a felony. And we got some answers on that too. There was a violation of election laws. We've talked a lot about the federal laws that we know were violated because the Justice Department, when Donald Trump was president, articulated those. Michael Cohen went to jail for violating those in part. But it turns out Donald Trump also violated New York State election laws. The false records that were made in installments, 9 months, according to Bragg, covered up the crime of defrauding the voters to support a candidate. There are also some language that he shared, Andrew Weissmann, about the amount of the wire transfers, tripping Donald Trump up in a criminal way. Talk about the sum and substance of what we understand now that we have heard Alvin Bragg speak.
Sure. So I think I have 3 points to make about that. One is, if you look at the big picture, is what Alvin Bragg is saying is, for a candidate who ran on fake news, and he's the truth teller, this was all about presenting a fake story of who he is to the electorate.
Conspiracy to do that, because he names AMI, he
absolutely
names his fake media allies.
Lawyers, AMI, National Enquirer, with the complicity of the people he was paying off, so that information would not get to the electorate. Reminds me so much, we were sitting here on the first impeachment, where the whole idea was to, again, have a fake story to the electorate. That's sort of the big picture. If you want to know why you should care, that's what's going on. And it happened to trip, as at least according to the charges here, various New York laws. Let me just go to the second point before I get into what are going to be the boring legal weeds, which is that I thought it was really smart of the DA to talk about why this is not selective prosecution. He made a point at the press conference to say, this is something that is charged in New York day in and day out. And he talked about ways in which this sort of felony is charged, not as a misdemeanor, but as a felony for bank secrecy, for sex crimes, for tax crimes, saying this is not out of the ordinary. Yes, is it something where you've seen a former president? Of course not, because when's the last time you had a president commit crimes like this? But it was very smart to help explain to the public why he is not being singled out in terms of what the Manhattan District Attorney Office charges.
And I'm sure Fox is leading with it.
Absolutely, of course. And then there's sort of the weeds, which is, as John and I were talking about, when you read the statement of facts and the indictment, you're left a little bit to wonder what precisely is the crime that leads to the sort of bump up. Why is it a felony? And there, Alvin Bragg did give more information. He didn't, he's maybe didn't give the exact sites, but he talked about federal and state election crimes. He talked about state tax crimes. He talked about the furthering the AMI false statements. So that was sort of, to me, that the New York tax and the AMI false statements, those parts seemed very strong to me. The campaign finance issues, whether it's state or federal, there's been a lot of discussion about legal challenges that are potentially available to the former president. But, and he'll make his motions and a judge will decide. But the issue, I think, for Donald Trump, if you are the defense here, is you might sort of pick at the edges and you might be able to do some damage to some of the charges, but it's really hard to see how you're going to have a motion to dismiss that's going to get rid of all of this. I mean, the idea, I think if you're sitting here looking at this, this is going to trial.
One of the questions he faced was about why others had passed it up. I just want to be really clear because we've had some new information about Bragg's predecessors from their own mouths from interviews. Cy Vance said, and it was a whopper of a news nugget, that he was asked to, quote, stand down by SDNY. And SDNY, for its part, actually found that Trump coordinated and directed the exact scheme described in today's indictment.
Yeah. And it's interesting about Cy Vance because he was pursuing, I think, with much more interest, the falsification of business records case. I have to say now, this is more your area, but prosecutors do disagree on cases and the strength of them. But when you heard Cy Vance on the weekend talk, he was asked to stand down and he was also facing obstacles while he was pursuing this case. He had, not only was he facing COVID, but he had the tax return fight going on. He went to the Supreme Court twice to try and get them. So there was a lot of things that sort of slow walked it. But I do think if you look back at Cy Vance and what he was doing, I think he put much more emphasis on the falsification or the business records where they were playing with the appraisals and saying if something is.
You plussed it up when it.
And then for the tax man, you put it down. And I think that's where he was sort of putting, and I still think that case could come forward as a criminal case. It's going to trial on the civil front in October. The New York Attorney General, Letitia James, is bringing it. But obviously right now, this one's definitely on the front burner for him.
Andrew's description of what Bragg finds, that the whole thing is a fraud, is how anyone that hadn't yet read your tax story is how I described it to them. I said, you got to read it. You got to read every word of it. Oh, it's long. No, but what it says is that everything he ran on was an absolute fraud. It is exactly how I would describe your body of reporting about his taxes.
Right. And I think you have to look at that nugget of him, that piece of him is just at his core, that everything has to be bigger. It has to be, it's just at the heart of him. And I have to say, one of the other things, just while we were reading this, it does look, and I'm imagining already, of course, what defense he's going to have. And I think he's going to say, I sign a lot of checks. And this is something that Michael Cohen and Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO, cooked up. It's going to be interesting to see. Alan Weisselberg did not appear before the grand jury. He's, incarcerated right now and didn't come in. He's facing potential charges on another matter to do with insurance fraud. Whether or not by the time this gets to trial, if there's been enough pressure brought on him, he could be a witness in this case when it comes to trial.
Andrew, Donald Trump's on tape directing Michael Cohen. I think the quote is, go back to Alan's office and figure it out. Would that be admitted?
Oh, yeah. That's what's called.
so his whole, I don't know anything about it.
Well, he could say, and they figured it out, and I didn't know what, I'm not.
But he says, can't you pay cash? I mean, he's involved in they call it a scheme.
It's a character of
Right.
It's really hard to say.
Do it in 20s and 10s.
We've seen this movie a few times.
Yeah, I mean, look, when you're the CEO or you're the head of a crime family, I mean, of course your defense is, I don't bother with those little details and whatever they're doing. I mean, here the problem is this is a small organization. This is not ExxonMobil or JP Morgan. This is a small outfit and he is a notorious micromanager. They will have witnesses up one side and down the other saying you couldn't move without him knowing and approving things. So that's not going to really help. As you said, Michael Cohen, if you thought that Donald Trump didn't know anything about this and you did this behind his back, why would you make a tape recording of him?
Right.
Because he would sit there and go like, what are you talking about? This is the first time ever hearing. And by the way, does anyone listening to this really think that if you heard Donald Trump say, I'm shocked that you were doing this? Of course not. We're all
well, let me play it.
I mean,
because here he is again, talking not just about the scheme, not just directing it and coordinating it, but about how the money should be paid. He suggests cash.
I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David, so that I'm going to do that right away. I've actually come up and I've spoken to Alan Weissmann about how to set the whole thing up with
So what are we going to pay?
Funding. Yes. And it's all the stuff, because you never know where that company, you never know where he's going to be. Correct. So I'm all over that, and I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be. Listen,
what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
don't pay for cash.
No.
Cash? No. And then I don't think people can get my buses very often. So
Cohen was like, we don't have that much cash for one thing. This is not a very cash-heavy institution. I think about a couple things that we've seen today, one of which is that image, that split screen image that we just had a second ago, which is sort of just, I can't help but think Alvin Bragg digging in, Donald Trump sloping off, flying away off to Florida. There's something about that. There's a kind of poetry to that. And I know he's going to give a speech tonight down in Florida, but there was something kind of there. This is supposedly his hometown. I keep coming back to that again. I can't get a fair trial in my hometown. I'm the king of this town. I have buildings all over this town. I can never get a fair trial there because people hate me so much, even though they love me in New York. It's like, something about this whole day that's had that flavor. The other thing that really strikes me at this moment, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, for a long time, because we now hear that December is the next hearing in this case. And man, for people who have been waiting for this moment and can now have this moment here today, to now be told that they're not going to have any progress on this case until December of this year, and that a lot of the lawyers that I know, Andrew's among them, a lot of people think that this case will not be heard in court until after the 2024 election, most likely. So everyone should just, at least as much satisfaction as people who want to see Trump held accountable may feel today. They also got to slow their roll a little bit here, because it's not going to happen fast. The big story to me in all these documents, and I'm going to throw this to add to Andrew, is that we all have been so focused on Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen. Is he credible? Is he not credible? Michael Cohen. And I read these documents and I go, man, this trial is going to be about David Pecker. That David Pecker turns out to be in the middle of this thing as much or more than Michael Cohen, and that he's all over. So as they laid it all out here, and as Bragg laid it out, the AMI in that piece, which of course has been the subject of a lot of discussion, a lot of reporting going back over years, but the fact that he's given the testimony he's given, he just seems like he's going to be the star witness here. Is that not right?
And let me just do this. Let me ask you to remind everybody who Pecker is.
So you should probably answer that, since in your
the famed head of the National Enquirer, which when people
and remind me of this, but all of you, wasn't he granted some limited immunity during the federal investigation?
Yes.
So some of what he knows may not be reflected in Michael Cohen's sentencing.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's correct. Right. And look, I mean, the National Enquirer, a publication that people laugh at and people say, oh, it's a tabloid, et cetera, in political circles, as you know well. They, for a long, long time, established a reputation for doing all kinds of stuff to sell on supermarkets, on supermarket stands. But they would also do the dirty stories about candidates for president and other places, and were almost always right. They had a reputation for being very good on very bad stories. And so when they decided to get in bed with Donald Trump, so to speak, it was seen.
No, actually.
Literally, I'll stick with figuratively still. I don't want to have the image of David Pecker. Anyway. But that they were going to have Donald Trump's back, which was kind of known in the campaign world and people who covered it in 2016. It was like, wow, that's going to be a powerful thing. Trump presumably has a lot of dirty laundry. The National Enquirer would be the most likely ones to get it all out. They were the ones who exposed John Edwards as a love child of Rael Hunter. They had often got John McCain, others that we all know, Bill Clinton, people, they were on those stories. And the fact that Pecker was going to have this, not just take hands off on Donald Trump, but was in league with him in this way, was seen as an enormous advantage for Trump before we even knew about the hush payments that we now have seen. It became exposed over the course of the last few years, and now we know even more about it in this document. So I just imagine that, it's not that Dan Pecker is a guy who most people would consider a white knight figure in American society. On the other hand, he's not a convicted liar.
And let me just read from the indictment again to bring it back to what John's talking about, because I think some of the narrative really does take us back in time to schemes that haven't been talked about. We haven't been talking about the doorman story, for example. Let me read this from the indictment.
The statement of facts.
The statement of facts, right. Well, I mean, we've got woman number one suppressing her account 1 month before the election on or about October 7th, 2016. Yeah. News broke that the defendant had been caught on tape saying to the host of Access Hollywood, "I just start kissing them. Women, it's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the genitals. You can do anything." The evidence shows that both the defendant and his campaign staff were concerned that the tape would harm his viability and reduce his standing with female candidates in particular. So shortly after the Access Hollywood tape became public, the AMI editor-in-chief contacted the AMI CEO about another woman two, who alleged she had a sexual encounter with the defendant while he was married. The AMI CEO told the AMI editor-in-chief to notify lawyer A. That's Michael Cohen.
Yes.
This goes on to detail exactly how this worked, exactly how the National Enquirer was in bed, figuratively, if you want, with the Trump campaign.
And I believe those two women are widely thought to be Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. This story right here, the doorman story, though, which is a story that was written about by Ronan Farrow and others back in 2018, is a story that many people have forgotten about, but involves the allegations that Donald Trump was the father of a child out of wedlock. And again, putting aside the truth that's been denied, but putting aside the truth or falsity of that claim, it became another instance here. And this, I think, will get more attention. Again, it's been written about, was written about back in 2018 when Ronan Farrow, I believe, broke it, but it got covered widely at the time. But now, like many Trump things, slipped into the memory hole. And here it is, prominently displayed in this document.
It's such a good point, and it's a good reminder. I want to bring in my colleague, Garrett Haake, in 1 second. But just to button up this point you're making, it's a good reminder that we have no idea what we have no idea about when it's under investigation.
100%.
We have no idea where these things are going. They're sprawling. They're opaque by design.
And so many things in the Trump era would kind of pop up, kind of shine up in this above the surface, above the waterline for a little while, and then disappear. And there's so much going on. Right. The news cycle was so fast, and the information just came so fast and furious at you that a lot of things that I think in this case and maybe others, things that people have kind of forgotten. Oh yeah, that was a controversy 4 years ago. What was that?
Right.
Those things may come back and make dramatic appearances in like this one instance in this case.
Garrett Haake, I know you were inside the courtroom. You were just at this news conference. I want to come back in time to the courtroom because we haven't had an authority on this yet. And I would like to ask you to tell us the story of what happened when the prosecutor rose and raised the concerns about the kind of content being pushed and disseminated by Donald Trump. I know there was a back and forth with Trump's legal team. Can you take me through how that went down?
Yeah, that was a striking moment, and you could tell it caught the Trump legal team somewhat off guard. Prosecutor Chris Conroy, who led most of the state's presentation, argued before the judge not for a gag order, but as part of a discussion about what's called a protective order regarding evidence that would be handed over as part of the discovery process, sort of bringing before the judge this issue of Mr. Trump's conduct, particularly online. And he had paper printed out copies of several of the Truth Social posts that Mr. Trump has made in recent days. He distributed them to the judge and the defense team. They included the post about death and destruction and the post that included the picture of Mr. Trump holding a baseball bat near a picture of DA Bragg. And he made the argument that that kind of conduct, which in and of itself was an issue, but could be particularly concerning as they move forward in this process if Mr. Trump had access to discovery evidence and would turn that same kind of rhetoric against potential witnesses to this investigation. The DA's office argued that they wouldn't be deterred from doing their job by this, but they don't want this kind of thing to be out in the bloodstream. Then an attorney for Mr. Trump stood up, Todd Blanche. This is the new member of Mr. Trump's legal team. And he made a very Trumpian argument here that sounded like a political argument I hear from some of the Republican lawmakers who do support Donald Trump, saying, look, my client is frustrated. He is very upset about this. He doesn't want to be here, and was basically cut off by the judge, saying, this is not about frustration. We're not talking about frustration. We're talking about this kind of rhetoric specifically. Nevertheless, they went back and forth about it a little bit. And before Judge Merchan weighed in here, making two things clear. First, he made it clear that he does not want to ever get to the point of having to impose a gag order, that he wouldn't have imposed one today, even if he had been asked, that he thinks that's such a high bar and raises such serious concerns about First Amendment concerns when you've got particularly a candidate running for office. That said, he warned both Mr. Trump and the prosecution in terms of the conduct of their witnesses to be very careful about what they say about this case in public, and that he didn't want to see any escalatory rhetoric. He didn't want to see anything that might incite or call for violence or anything that might undermine the rule of law. Then he said if that does continue to be the case, he might look differently or more seriously at other posts or other pieces of information that were put in front of him. So conflating two issues here a little bit. One, the idea of Mr. Trump's inflammatory posts, kind of flirt with the idea of political violence around elements of this case. Also with the defense's claims that people like Michael Cohen, who come out and stand on the courthouse steps or appear on programs like this one, are somehow discriminatory to Mr. Trump's rights or damaging to the rule of law there. Merchan made it pretty clear, the judge made it pretty clear, he's not keen on either of those types of conduct. Again, does not want to impose a gag order, but told both sets of attorneys to make it clear to their clients and to their witnesses that he doesn't want to hear a lot of that kind of talk from anybody in the weeks going forward as this case moves forward.
Garrett, you can give me I got to go if we press against your deadlines here. I know you have many demands on you, but I want to ask you a couple more questions about the lawyers. Is there any sense that this judge knew, or if there was any situational awareness about something our friend and colleague Joyce Vance tweeted, that Donald Trump Jr. was posting on social media about the judge's daughter during today's proceedings?
It's not clear to me, based on anything I heard from the judge, that would be something that he knew about. Donald Trump Sr. made a similar post on Truth Social earlier today about the, sort of alluding to the judge's daughter as well. There was nothing in the judge's comments or the comments from the prosecutors that made me think that was the kind of thing he knew about specifically. But I think this idea of comments that could be perceived as detrimental to the rule of law is the kind of category that could fall under. And Nicolle, I mean, I've thought about this a lot over the last couple of days. I think this is one of the challenges with the gag order, or even this restrictive protective order around discovery, which I think we should talk about a little bit more too, is that, you might get into a lot of specific discussions over a span of months. I mean, the next hearing in this case, where all parties are expected to be present, won't be until December. You might get into really lengthy discussions about sort of what kind of speech tiptoes up to or over the lines, Merchan said. So he was not specific about the kind of speech he doesn't want to see, but described sort of these broad categories that would create additional concern for him, or more action might be required going forward.
What is the issue that has been swirling around today about Joe Tacopina being in contact with Stormy Daniels? Did that come up, and what do you understand about that concern?
That was interesting. So that was actually brought up by prosecutors for the state. They argued that Joe Tacopina, who has been, kind of the most public-facing attorney for Donald Trump during this whole process, might have a conflict of interest that might lead Mr. Trump to want to disqualify him from being a member of his legal team. And they argued that conflict of interest was some years ago, when this whole process was getting started. It wasn't clear to me whether it was 2016 or 2017, that Stormy Daniels had reached out to Joe Tacopina's law practice about he potentially representing her, and that they might have had privileged communications that would put him in kind of a conflict of interest position here. When that question was raised, Tacopina stood up and made his own argument about that, saying that he never personally spoke to Stormy Daniels, that she had only communicated with paralegals in his office, and that anything that she had communicated with him or with his office was kind of voided out by the fact that she discussed all of it in her book anyway, and that would have voided any claims of privilege that might have existed between the two of them. So he sort of argued that this was all behind him. But the judge tried to make it clear, and I think elicited a verbal acknowledgement from Donald Trump that if he was concerned about that kind of conflict, he was within his rights to get Tacopina off his legal team, that he made it very clear to Donald Trump, you have a right to have counsel who's not conflicted. And if this is a thing that you're concerned about, basically you have the right to say so down the line. But Tacopina kind of defended himself on that point in the courtroom. I got no indication from Mr. Trump that he was particularly concerned about it. And again, it was something the state raised. I mean, Nicolle, I'm not a lawyer, but it's almost the kind of thing that could be a head game for the state too, right? To say like, all right, yeah, by the way, we're going to mention that one of your own attorneys might be an issue. You know, I don't know where this goes, but it'll be interesting to watch Joe Tacopina and his media appearances and kind of the role he plays with the Trump defense team going forward after this was brought up in open court.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Trump is more likely to fire a lawyer over a mustache he doesn't like than a legal conflict. But it's so interesting to hear these things that have been out there all day that you've reported out for us. We're so grateful to have you, Garrett Haake. Thank you so much.
Hey, everybody, it's Savannah Guthrie.
And I'm Hoda Kotb, and we've got some great news to share.
The Today Show is now available wherever you get your podcasts.
Can you believe that? Right now, you can get your daily dose of news and headlines and the day's top interviews from us right here every single morning.
We have what you need to start your day, and it's available every day, wherever you get your podcasts.
So why not subscribe and follow today to start listening?
David Jolly, let me bring you in on this. I understand the equivalence that the judge is giving to conduct, but frankly, one of it endangers the lives of the judge and his family and the DA, and the other weakens the state's case. I mean, they're really not the same. And let's be real. Last night, Jesse Waters called the district attorney a felon. I mean, it is not the same thing. And I understand concerns about Michael Cohen's media appearances. I mean, we'll just put it all out there. He's made a lot of them here. But the truth is, as John Heilemann just said, this is not an indictment that rests solely on Michael Cohen's testimony or any documents he produced. It is much broader than that. Your thoughts about today's goings-on?
Yeah, look, there is no equivalence. I think any judge would say to both parties, be careful what you and any possible witnesses discuss in a public setting. That's routine. But in terms of the vitriol and the rancor and frankly the incitement to violence, one could argue that is being done in the name of Donald Trump or people close to him, there is no equivalence on the other side. To have family members of the judge, their photo tweeted out, to have Donald Trump himself in a fundraising email go back to the Revolutionary War and the World Wars and to say now's the time the country's going to turn the corner to defeat political prosecutions. This is exactly not just what mobsters do, but what Donald Trump does. And I think this is why we are entering probably a more permanent, dangerous moment in American history. I mean, very well, Donald Trump will get the Republican nomination, having either been indicted multiple times on multiple matters, having been convicted. Donald Trump could get the nomination for the Republican presidency sitting in a Manhattan jail. I think his political strength would be that strong. So that is something that as a culture and as a country, we probably have to begin to accept the new normal of what it means for our politics. Nicolle, if I could ask a purely legal question of Andrew that I think has been brought up in the last hour, I think it's very important. And it goes to this question of elevating to a felony the charge. If the charge is falsifying business records, which can be brought as a misdemeanor, there is the underlying tie to what we know is the campaign finance violation. You have Michael Cohen's guilty plea to a federal campaign finance violation. You have AMI's non-prosecution agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. My question for you is this, Andrew. Does Bragg have to prove that question all over again? Can he submit as evidence for elevating to this a felony, Michael Cohen's plea deal or AMI's non-prosecution agreement? What grounds does Donald Trump now have to defeat the elevation of the charge to a felony?
Great question. So The fact that somebody pled guilty to the crime is not going to be admissible to prove the case against Donald Trump. So the fact that Michael Cohen said, I'm guilty of this federal campaign violation, that might be admissible to impeach Michael Cohen, to understand his motivation and what he did, but that's not proof itself, because it's sort of out of court and it doesn't, under the rules of evidence, get admitted. In order to prove that sort of felony enhancement, it also is not necessary, though, for the DA to prove that crime. What they have to prove is that the false filing was intended to further or cover up some other crime. So it just has to have that intent. That's what you were trying to do, is you were trying to, in this case, conceal some other crime. And what the DA appears to be saying is that could include the federal campaign violation that Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to, a state campaign violation, an AMI false business filing, and it appears potentially a state tax crime. So there appears to be sort of this, litany of all sorts of things that could include that sort of felony bump up. It's also important to remember that the jury could be charged that if you don't find for the felony, the bump up, that what's called a lesser included offense is the misdemeanor. So the fact that the misdemeanors are not charged doesn't mean that the jury doesn't get allowed to consider them. When you have something that's totally a lesser included offense under state law, the jury can be told, if you don't find the felony, you have this backup. So those are sort of implicit in this case.
Andrew, let me just be in the weeds with you for a little further in the weeds with you on one thing.
Even further?
Well, just to clarify, just to state this one thing. David raised one issue about what bumps it up to the felony, which is kind of, what do you have to prove? It's the case generally, I'm correct, that people think trying to use the federal campaign law violations is a little iffy compared to a a DA from Manhattan dealing only with New York laws. That's kind of what what people, that's solid from everybody's point of view, right?
No. There's arguments, there are problems, and I won't say that what the law is going to be, but the problem with picking a federal violation as the bump up is that it's not clear that when the New York law says you have to be doing this to conceal some other crime, it's not clear that includes a federal crime.
Right.
So that's the challenge of pick. That's that. But here's the problem with the state election crimes is that there is usually for a federal campaign, there's a preemption doctrine, meaning that, so this is like, now you're in law school.
What about on the taxes?
So absolutely. So for the state election crime, you can be sure that the defense team is going to say, wait a second, that can't be used because this is really an area that only the federal law governs. Right. That is why the two things that I was really interested to hear were the other two possible grounds. Right. A state tax crime, I don't really see a problem. That seems strong.
Yeah.
And the AMI false filing, don't see a problem.
Susanne, how did this get broader and narrower in your view today?
I just think it got broader in terms of now it looks like we have a conspiracy, though the conspiracy is not charged, and an interesting conversation to be had around that. But you've got both.
They call it scheme.
The scheme, yeah. And you've got now Stormy Daniels. You've got the doorman who was trying to sell a story. There was another catch and kill, and Karen McDougal. And I think now it's gotten much broader. And you have to think, I know there's been a lot of debate in the weeds about sort of the charges, and we've been talking about it for weeks now. But this is very cinematic when you look at it. I mean, it really is. It's a conspiracy alleged before a presidential election to sway an election. I think there's movies about this.
It's really,
in some ways,
absolutely.
there's nothing more important in terms of how we can sort of look at the rule of law and how it should be brought. I mean, I know these are, we're talking about falsification of big business records, but when we really lift it up, it's incredible.
It's to your first point about how who he is at his core is a big, giant lie. His wealth, his business acumen, his success, his political reach, everything is a lie.
It's, I feel like we never can get away now from January 6th. So now we're going to go back and be in 2016. The cinema here is the 2016 campaign again, which is for a lot of people still the original sin. I will say every politician we've ever worked for in your case or covered in my case has not been totally straight with the American people about who they are. They all present certain falsities and certain truths. They emphasize certain things back away. The question is whether you break laws in the process of doing it, or whether you're just spinning, shading. That's what politicians do routinely. The question is, do they break laws or not? And it looks like Trump, that's what we're really going to find out here, is do he break laws along the way in order to foist a false version of himself on America? Obviously,
looks like he did. Spoiler alert. Andrew Weissmann, you have been on this set for hours and hours doing an extraordinary public service and personal one. Thank you very much
for
being here and talking all of us through it. So you've been explaining these things to us. And I believe about 12 weeks ago, you cautioned me and all of our viewers to broaden the lens and look at this not so narrowly. And as usual, and I'm keeping score, you were right. You were always right. You're always right, too. But you know that, and you're sticking around a little bit longer. David Jolly, thank you for being part of our coverage and injecting the weeds, which we hadn't spent enough time in. So thank you very much. Our viewers are down there with you. A very quick break for us. There's much more breaking news analysis still ahead for us. We'll talk with one of the reporters who dug into that story that brought us to this moment and this very indictment, the Inquirer catch and kill scheme. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York City, where the first ever to be indicted ex-president has just departed. He is wheels up on his way back to South Florida. If you're just joining us on this historic day, we are fresh off the twice impeached, now indicted ex-president being arrested and arraigned on 34 felony counts of falsification of business records. All 34 of those are felonies. Trump pleaded not guilty to all counts. From the statement of fact that accompanied the newly unsealed indictment, quote, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. In the last hour, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg spoke about that scheme.
It's not just about one payment. It is 34 business records, 34 false statements in business records that were concealing criminal conduct. And the earlier question about New York State election law, when I talked about conspiracy to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. Those unlawful means, we allege, include the conduct set forth in the statement of facts, which is additional false statements separate and apart from the charged ones in AMI documents, planned false statements to taxing authorities. It is not just that one $130,000 wire payment.
Let's bring into our coverage our esteemed panel. Mary McCord is here. She's a former top official in the Justice Department's National Security Division. Harry Litman is here, former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, the host of the Talking Feds podcast. Joining us at the table is former Assistant District Attorney Catherine Christian. She is a veteran of the Manhattan DA's office. And our friend John Heilemann is still here. Catherine, I start with you. Your reaction to everything that's transpired today.
Well, for people who were hoping there'd be more than, charges related to Stormy Daniels and the catch and kill, they might be disappointed. But these are 34 felony counts. So it's a serious case. You can argue, it's only about a porn star, but it's a serious case. DA Bragg just said there involved documents. Every single count involves a document that was falsely entered allegedly into Mr. Trump's business with the intent to defraud and with the intent to conceal other crimes. And he is alleging that it was New York State election law and New York federal law involving the contribution of the caps on the contribution.
The size, right?
Yeah. So some people were hoping there'd be a tax fraud count or that. But you know what? It is a serious case. And there are going to be lots of motions filed by the defense. They said so. They had their own little mini press conference outside. But the statement of facts and Michael Cohen, with the baggage that he has, everything, according to the DA's office, that he is accusing Mr. Trump of has been corroborated. And he can be considered, I dealt with cooperators before. sort of the Trump mini-me. And that's why you can believe everything he says, because Mr. Trump trusted him. And so you can believe that Mr. Trump trusted him to give over this hush payment.
Mary McCord, if you could just take us through what the world saw today. It's a lot more than the last president of this country, for whom about 25% of our population has reverence. A larger swath has disdain, and I guess a big swath is indifferent. But the world over saw the last person who was America's commander-in-chief criminally charged with 34 felonies today.
Yeah, and I think I would also point to the framing that Alvin Bragg used, the district attorney, because I think that was very smart on his part. In the first two paragraphs of the statement of facts, which frankly are much more interesting, the indictment itself, he paints this as part of a scheme to influence the 2016 election, right? And if we start back in 2016 with a scheme to influence the election, and then we think about where we've come since 2016, including the 2020 election, the ongoing scheme to override the will of the people, even in the 2020 election. I think this is just the beginning of this painting of a picture over a series of years of Donald Trump's attempts to undermine democracy, attempts to undermine the rule of law, attempts to avoid accountability. And I think what the world saw is that this is a man who is finally being held to account. And so, Christine talks about the individual counts, and they're important. They totally are. But I think understanding where this fits in to the bigger picture of this continued, concerted, day by day and week by week and month by month and year by year effort is really important for all to see.
Someone familiar with this investigation told me that what will come into focus today is the cover-up, and that we have as a country this historical analog to Richard Nixon, that the cover-up is often the crime that is more easy to understand and inform the public about. To your point, I'm going to, one of the benefits of having 2 hours and all these smart people here to help me fill it is I have time to read what you just called out. So let me read the beginning of this statement of facts. The defendant, Donald Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 election. From August 2015 to December 2017, the defendant orchestrated a scheme with others to influence the 2016 presidential election by identifying and purchasing negative information about him to suppress its publication and benefit the defendant's electoral prospects. In order to execute the unlawful scheme, the participants violated election laws and made and caused false entries in the business records of various entities in New York. The participants also took steps that mischaracterized, for tax purposes, the true nature of the payments made in furtherance of the scheme. And then it goes on, and it is, you're right, Mary, the most compelling narrative of the crimes that took place in this really crucial, I've worked on lots of campaigns, the most crucial window is exactly this period from August until any election day. And that was the period in which this catch and kill scheme was pursued aggressively at Donald Trump's direction. It's clear that a lot of these witnesses were also made available to SDNY. Why do you think we didn't, when there was a change in administrations, hear anything about this case being reexamined?
That remains a question that there's a lot of speculation about and that I can't answer. And I don't know whether any of it had to do with, by the time we had a change in administration, we'd also had the January 6th insurrection, the Justice Department focusing, huge amounts of resources, not only on the individuals who violently assaulted the Capitol, but also working their way up from there. And certainly we're seeing that now with Jack Smith's investigation. I don't know if they thought that kind of going back into history to a case that was an older case would subject them overly to criticism about being overly political. And they wanted to keep their eyes, focused on the more recent, more, in many ways, more, violent, crimes and things that were really, again, go to the heart of our democracy. But this is where I'd say, again, as we just discussed, the way this is framed, this is really just a beginning of going at the heart of our democracy. And as you just indicated, this time period where these payments took place in that August of 2016 until the election, that was a crucial time period. That's when, in fact, this is in the statement of facts, that's when the Hollywood video came out with, some really pretty outrageous statements that former President Trump was caught on tape saying about women. I remember at the time thinking this was surely the end, and it wasn't the end. But if you'd have piled on top of that the Stormy Daniels allegations, the Karen McDougal allegations, or known even about attempts to pay them off, that could have been all the more damaging. So this effort and attempt to influence elections, it started before 2016, it continued to 2020, it's continuing today, and it's going to continue into the 2024 election. And we have got to be vigilant, and we've got to talk about those efforts, and hopefully he'll be held accountable, not just for this, but so many other things that are being investigated right now.
And Mary, I don't mean to put you in the position of having to defend or explain away DOJ's actions, but you are probably the most senior former Justice Department official we have any access to. And your framing and pointing us accurately to Alvin Bragg's framing begs the question, is it not an equal obligation that the United States Department of Justice, in service to our democracy, follow up on this case, or at least shine a light on why they declined to prosecute it, if that was Merrick Garland's decision once he took over in March of 2021?
Well, Merrick Garland has said many times that the Department of Justice speaks through its court documents, its pleadings, its indictments, its motions, its briefs, and it hasn't spoken on this. And I don't think I'm not going to hold my breath and wait for AG Garland or the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco or anyone else over at DOJ to speak out about this. I do think, it's probably something that was the subject of high-level discussions. There probably were meetings with the SDNY office, the prosecutors there, to talk about the evidence and go through it. I don't know if there's something that they thought was weak or problematic. Obviously relying on someone like Michael Cohen, which would have been probably necessary, is always something of a risk. But on the other hand, the Department of Justice relies on cooperators who've pleaded guilty to very serious crimes, including in many cases violent crimes, all the time. And so it's a risk that I still say it's been years and years since I've been in the department. Once a public servant, I guess, I don't know, maybe always a public servant. But, it's something that the department is used to. And I wish I had a better theory or a better answer, Nicolle, but I just don't, other than what I've offered up just now. And I would love someday to hear more about it, but I don't know that we will.
So, Harry, you are in a similar situation as Mary every time you're on, and it is because I think I and our viewers rely on both of you, and we give federal prosecutors and former DOJ officials all the authority and trust of everyone that helps talk us through these times. I don't know anyone who is trusted and relied upon more than folks like you and Mary. To that end, Jesse Waters of Fox News called Alvin Bragg a felon yesterday, said he should self-indict. The ex-president, twice impeached, now indicted, charged with 34 felonies, today was posting on social media to his millions of followers about the judge's kids. We're at a moment where Alvin Bragg and the judge and everyone involved in this case, the future jurors, will be at risk for doing their duty as citizens. And I believe as a country, we deserve an answer as to why SDNY, who examined the same facts and has at its disposal federal laws that are black and white. Crystal, the conversation Heilemann and Andrew Weissmann had about which crime was the second crime that bumped it from a bit. You don't have to have that at a federal level. It's campaign finance violations. John Edwards' career was ended for less. When and how and why does Alvin Bragg get the backup from a federal system that looked at the same evidence and found the same criminality from Donald Trump?
All right. So this has been something that's been really dredged up by Bragg's doing it. Let me just raise 2 points. Of course, we don't know. First, as to the commentary by DOJ, remember, as part and parcel of what Mary was just citing, when you decide not to bring a case, you don't talk. Remember who did talk? James Comey, and it is prejudicial to defendants. There's a good reason for it. But let me just say, I wasn't there, Nicolle, but
actually, let's
really
talk about Comey, though, because that's a great parallel. Comey, I think, would say that he talked about it because there was a national interest. And don't you think that there's a national interest?
He was wrong, and he dirtied up Hillary Clinton. But let me make one more point.
We really worried about dirtying up Donald Trump and his hush money scheme to a porn star?
Is not some part of the DOJ's work mission statement and not something that Merrick Garland would be doing, even if we all might like it salaciously. But one other point, I just really urge everyone to think about this in its time. It is now March 2021. Garland has just taken the reins. His number one lookout is to right the ship at DOJ. He's generally focused on not relitigating the past. And as Mary says, he's got quite a lot to go after for Donald Trump. I think it's an understandable reaction, and maybe not to fight about it today, but I just that he would say, look, for now, we've got plenty on our plate, and if we come out of the box in my second week here, charge him with relatively with relatively insignificant crimes from before he was president, talk about the department being subject to being pilloried on being political. So it's just important to think about it as of March 2021. But I'd like to focus on Bragg.
Well, let me ask you, do you think Bragg's case is trivial?
You just said so.
No. So I'm sorry, but I really don't.
You just said so. You just described it. I wrote it down as trivial.
Yeah. I said relatively, and many people have pointed out in the overall menu, it goes least to the wickedness of Trump. I think it is significant for the reasons Mary made, although I found what's most interesting about the indictment is that it does, when you read that statement of facts, Nicolle, which is not part of the indictment, the next thing that follows is the conspiracy itself. So he's basically, with the indictment, drawn a kind of an empty vessel to pour material in, including from the statement of facts. And that's an interesting strategy. On the one hand, we'll see legal challenges of the sort that everyone was anticipating coming into this juncture, but he's left himself maximum flexibility. But it's going to be this open-ended thing while Bragg is not talking in the public eye, Trump will be starting at 8 o'clock tonight. And that the indictment itself does give the grist for him to say, what is this, 34 accounting records? It's not, I agree, but he made the indictment itself very, very bare bones.
Here's the thing, John Heilemann, and maybe this is the peril of mixing legal and political analysis. Yeah. If a dead body that Trump had, taken credit for making dead had been produced, he'd call it trivial. I mean, Tacopino and the fancy lawyer he got to bolster Tacopino's sort of tawdry credentials sounded like Michael Cohen. Yeah. They sounded like Rudy Giuliani. You could roll tape on Rudy during Mueller. You can roll tape on Cohen when he was still working for. You can roll tape on everything from inciting a deadly insurrection about the United States government with the mission of hanging Mike Pence to falsifying business records. And Trump says the same thing to his base.
Yeah. I keep thinking that from the moment this happened, that like history writes about this, that this case will not be trivial. And it won't be trivial because it's done this important thing, and some people have alluded to this notion that in the eyes of the world, they see the American justice system working how it's supposed to work, and that even a former president can be brought to heel and to be accountable for his actions, given a fair trial eventually, et cetera, et cetera. It also feels to me like this very large thing has happened, which is a thing that was once unthinkable, moved from the realm of the unthinkable to the thinkable to now it has happened.
Right.
And for other, whether it's the special counsel or the DA, the district attorney in Georgia or wherever, and for the grand jurors in those places, the thing of like the discomfort with doing something so big first is no longer there. It's now a thing that's happened in America. Now have an indicted ex-president. And I just can't help but think that even if it doesn't have a direct influence on any of them, that if we see additional indictments in the cases that Harry thinks are less trivial, I'm making fun of Harry a little bit there, but in the big cases, the insurrection case, the classified documents case, the Georgia case, all of those are more significant in terms of public policy, in terms of the history of the country. If we see one or more indictment in those cases, history will write about it and say, this is what broke the ice. That is the narrative people will write. And I'm not sure they're wrong. There's just a thing that happens in the culture and in the psychology of people who have to sit in jury rooms or sit in rooms with prosecutors making decisions about charging, that a thing that has never happened before, it's just hard to get over to do that thing. Once it's happened, it's like, okay, now we just have to judge the law. And in a lot of these cases, the law doesn't seem to be on Donald Trump's side.
I mean, then this was the point, frankly, this was one of the values of the 1-6 Select Committee. They investigated Donald Trump. They hauled in every single member of his inner circle, and they either testified, some of them took the fifth, but they participated in one way or another. They're all still standing. I mean, some of them aren't serving in the Republican caucus anymore, but they're still around. They can live and tell.
It's the shattering of the myths of Donald Trump gets away scot-free. Well, no, he doesn't. He lost in 2020. And the Republican Party has paid a price politically, not legally, but politically. He's untouchable. He's Houdini. All of these BS phrases, the myth making that Trump perpetuates in his people more than anybody, but that others perpetuate also. Every time something like this happens, he loses in a presidential election. He costs the Republicans the Senate. An indictment
Three times.
An indictment happens in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Every time one of those things happens, it's just another chink another puncture wound in the myth of Donald Trump is somehow this untouchable, he always gets away with it. He never pays a price. Like, well, we're starting to add up all the prices he's paid, and he hasn't paid the ultimate price yet. But that's how you ultimately make progress against a figure as big and as in many people's minds as deleterious as Donald Trump's, is that you do it bit by bit by bit, and then all of a sudden the whole thing just crumbles like a Jenga game,
Kevin, I want to ask you, I'm cognizant of the fact that we've got two very different worldviews from Mary and Harry. Mary pointed out that Alvin Bragg's framing is as elemental to democracy as the January 6th cases. Democracy, what happens in the 12 weeks before voters go to the polls. Harry's sort of theory of the case, and I'll give Harry a chance to underline or clarify if he wants to. I will. Is that Merrick Garland may have decided this was too tawdry or too trivial, or he may have been too busy. Mary and Harry both say he might have been, too overloaded. Now, if I committed 3 crimes, I'm pretty sure the Justice Department would have found the time to prosecute me for all 3. But maybe Trump, maybe they were too busy. How does that feel? And just take me through from Cy Vance revealing, I believe for the first time, he was told to quote, stand down.
Yes.
By SDNY. I have some reporting that suggests that they then learned through the media that the disposition of that case. And then that some federal prosecutors think it's too trivial for DOJ to touch.
Well, and I worked for Cyrus Vance, and I was watching that yesterday when he said that he was asked to stand down. And it's not trivial. I said there are going to be people who are going to say, oh my God, it's just about the porn star case. No, it is about someone who was going to become president and then becoming president, conspiring to promote his candidacy, to violate election law, to violate the federal election law. And yes, he's innocent until proven guilty, clearly, but I agree with John. This is a statement. I now in private practice to clients, if they ask me if they can do something, I can say to them, well, the president of the United States was indicted for that. So no, you can't. So it is about, treating everyone without fear or favor. Just because people are saying, oh, you're doing this trivial case, he's the former president. And as you said, you would have been indicted for it. It's a novel legal theory, but so what? It is a serious crime. 34 of them.
34 serious crimes.
And look at the photos of Mr. Trump today and him coming into the courtroom. He looked sober and serious and reserved. He knows this is a serious deal. Who wants to be charged with 34 felonies? So I've never seen him like that. I mean, it's not even angry. He actually looks the way I've seen some criminal defendants who are like, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble. That's what he looked like today. So, and people need to see that too.
Did you say angry or hangry?
Hangry. Hangry.
Hangry. He's a little hungry too.
It went longer. I thought maybe like lunch
what he looked like? Was he look?
I want to give Harry a chance. So let me put
he looks. You don't want to go in that courtroom.
Yeah.
Like
nobody does.
34 crimes, one crime. That's a room you don't want to be in.
Yeah,
and when you're walking in there, you're like, oh man, I'm going in here. This is not going to be good.
Yeah. Harry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just very briefly, that sort of ton of bricks feeling. I've been in a lot of arraignments, and his bravado, I think, does disappear quickly. It's a sobering experience. Look, please do not mischaracterize me as saying that this crime is trivial. On the contrary, I've been saying for weeks it's important for Bragg to take it out of the caricature position of an accounting error and putting it in exactly this frame of the entire. I've been saying it's not the crime. It's the cover-up, meaning it's a scheme to distort the election. That is not trivial. I used the T word with relatively just to try to describe possibly Garland's mindset when he comes into office and is considering a menu of crimes possibly to investigate against Trump. Separately from that, it's important, and I 100% concur that the basic notion here is not about the payout. It's not about the affair. It is precisely about the very serious matter, for just the reasons Mary say, could have actually altered a presidential election, that entire scheme beginning, as they now have the ability to plead it, but it's not in the indictment, with the agreement with the National Enquirer in 2015 and going even into the White House. That is not trivial, nor have I said anything close to that for the last several weeks.
No, I was asking you to try to explain to us why Merrick Garland might have passed on it. Let me just follow up with this. The Justice Department under Donald Trump, Jeff Sessions appointed a special counsel, Robert Mueller, to get to the bottom of whether Russia, in coordination with the Trump campaign, impacted the 2016 election. It seems that it is at least a not novel notion to get to the bottom of threats to democracy. Would you like to see this Justice Department answer whether or not they looked at it from that perspective before they decided to pass on it?
That's a real toughie, because the general policy, which I always, adhere to as U.S. attorney, is you don't want to comment when you say no. I take your point. There's an exception to the policy when it's really very important sort of public issue. So I can certainly see that now. But again, what's on the other side is the Comey debacle, and that he is now the federal interest is potentially being vindicated. So the reason for the decision in March, yes, I guess so. But to me, the most important thing is we are now actually litigating it. I want to say one more quick thing. I'm confused generally about the point, and maybe your guest can answer it, with that Vance said he was told to stand down, because I actually thought he did pursue the investigation up to the time he left office and said Bragg would make it. So also the SDNY couldn't have brought it when he was president. So I just think we need more facts there.
It's something that he said in an interview with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. Right. It's a comment that I believe he's making for the first time. And I think it's something that certainly, I asked Zoe Lofgren about it, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren. She said it, quote, smells bad. Claire McCaskill said that it's understandable that while Barr was there, we wouldn't understand why that was. And the timeline, I think we're all saying the same thing. The timeline would be very helpful. I would say one more thing. I mean, we're going to cover the threat environment in these United States. Mary is expert in understanding this. We talk about political violence. Tragically, it's become a new normal, right? We talk about Paul Pelosi as someone who was a victim of a heinous crime that could happen to the family member of anybody in the arena. That is because of Donald Trump. And that Alvin Bragg went first has a backstory to it. And that is that DOJ under Merrick Garland did not pick up cases for which they found criminality on Donald Trump's part. Fani Willis may go next. Fani Willis is investigating a crime that wouldn't have kept Donald Trump in office. So I will never stop asking where DOJ is. And I guess my last question for you, Catherine, is would it be helpful if DOJ had brought this case, or do you think there wouldn't be a need for a state prosecution?
Well, they're not going to now because Mr. Bragg brought it. So it was the time to do it was when Michael Cohen pled guilty.
And went to jail.
And went to jail for it. The little fish and the big fish got away. So it's just not going to happen now. And Mr. Bragg did it. So,
any thoughts about him personally as you see his family come under brutal political attack and demand?
Well, it's heartbreaking. He's just doing his job. I just looked at my phone. I just got a very offensive tweet by email.
Well, welcome to Twitter.
An email, about my appearance today, and it's a little bit racist. So it's. I know that office. I was there for over 30 years. They're ethical. They don't prosecute cases that they are political. That's just the office it's been. So it's an unfair critique of him.
Thank you very much for being part of our coverage. Harry, John, and Mary stick around a little bit longer, although right now I think Harry's trying to find a conference call he has to join. I'm just kidding. When we come back, we'll talk to one of the reporters who dug all of this up and shared it with the public in the first place. He dug deep into the story that has now contributed to the indictment of Donald J. Trump. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere today.
Hey, everybody, it's Savannah Guthrie.
And I'm Hoda Kotb, and we've got some great news to share.
The Today Show is now available wherever you get your podcasts.
Can you believe that? Right now, you can get your daily dose of news and headlines and the day's top interviews from us right here every single morning.
We have what you need to start your day, and it's available every day, wherever you get your podcasts.
So why not subscribe and follow today to start listening?
Donald Trump, executives at the publishing company American Media Incorporated, Mr. Cohen, and others agreed in 2015 to a catch and kill scheme. That is, a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election. As part of this scheme, Donald Trump and others made 3 payments to people who claimed to have negative information about Mr. Trump.
Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg explaining for those of us watching and following along at home the catch and kill scheme that was directed by the ex-president that he and his allies pursued in order to better his chances of winning the 2016 presidential election. Bragg's indictment mentions multiple payments in the scheme to adult film star Stormy Daniels, Playboy model Karen McDougal, and a former Trump Tower doorman who claimed to have a story about a child that Trump fathered out of wedlock. Joining our coverage, writer-at-large for the New York Times and the Sunday Magazine, Jim Rutenberg, Mary, Harry, and John are all back with us. Jim, I remember all of your reporting on this. I remember dragging you in here to talk about it. And I remember you in the documentary made about the New York Times at the beginning of one of them talking about how this went down. Explain, just remind us how catch and kill worked and how much, to John Heilemann's point earlier in the broadcast, it benefited Trump and Trump alone.
Well, as a great American said, it's deja vu all over again. But I never expected to see it like this. Okay, catch and kill, right there out of the district attorney's mouth, is a tabloid term for grabbing a story, catching the story before it's out, and killing it, sitting on it, usually by paying the source who's going to go forward with said story. In the case of then candidate Trump, as we had reported in great detail, there had been an effort with him and the National Enquirer to kind of get ahead of any stories, to lock them down. And it's been clear now, as you've talked about Michael Cohen, the president's then lawyer and fixer, when he struck his plea deal with prosecutors, he said that his intention in helping in these catch and kill deals was to protect President Trump or then candidate Trump during the lead up to the campaign to protect his reputation. Similarly, American media, which owns the Inquirer, has spoken about the arrangements to pay off, particularly Stormy Daniels and the fitness model Karen McDougal, who alleged to have had an affair with then candidate Trump, or not even candidate Trump, that was done again to help him in his campaign. In campaign finance parlance, federal law, I'll note, these are things of value. Yes, it's a huge dollar amount, but these are dollar amounts spent to help someone in a campaign setting. That's what's alleged to have happened here, and other players in the scheme have said that's what they were doing.
And when you saw in today's indictment that the scheme is very much described, Mary McCord called it the frame of the felony counts. Did that surprise you, or sort of what did that bring back to you in terms of understanding the story and how it worked in terms of catching and killing the stories in Trump's SDNY found that he coordinated and directed the hush money scheme?
Well, on one hand, I'm not surprised because Trump was throughout the previous legal documents in the other case, the other people who were investigated in relation to these cases, he was individual one. So he was always in the mix of this. We knew about early meetings between Trump and David Pecker, the head of AMI, to talk about being, as the documents here today call, eyes and ears for Trump, to make sure that stories that they were listening out for stories that could hurt him. So I'm not surprised by that. It's really something, though, to see this as the first time a president's indicted, that these are the cases, and I'm very interested in that these are records charges. But of course, we always knew that these payments, the way that they surfaced was because there was such a complicated interplay between shell companies and the way the money was moving and how Michael Cohen had to try to get reimbursed. So all of that was always, these were always triggers as we saw it as we were doing our reporting.
Jim Rutenberg, let me play you some of the players in their own words talking about how they interacted with one another and how the money moved and who was at the center of it.
2016, prior to the election, I was contacted by Keith Davidson, who is the attorney, or was the attorney for Miss Clifford, for Stormy Daniels. And after several rounds of conversations with him about purchasing her life rights for $130,000, what I did each and every time is go straight into Mr. Trump's office and discuss the issue with him. When it was ultimately determined, and this was days before the election, that Mr. Trump was going to pay the $130,000. In the office with me was Alan Weissberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization. He acknowledged to Alan that he was going to pay the $130,000 and that Alan and I should go back to his office and figure out how to do it.
Everybody knows what happens. I mean, Michael Cohen is sentenced in prison, serves time in this case. Pecker's immunized. I mean, why do you think they go through all that? To get to who?
To get to, I'm sorry, but to immunize.
What do you think the point is of this investigation? That we learn all this because Cohen's under criminal investigation. He's charged, he's sentenced, he goes to prison. As a part of that, Pecker is given limited immunity. A lot of what we first learned from Pecker, we saw the fruits of it today in this investigation, but the federal government gives him a limited immunity. I don't know if I'm using that term legally, but he has some sort of immunity to testify in the federal case. What do you think they were looking for? I mean, Cohen didn't have the sex. Cohen wasn't running for office. His campaign didn't benefit. I mean, do you think there was some point where prosecutors and investigators were pursuing the facts wherever they led, and then that federal investigation stopped short? And if you could just tie together that probe and that effort with the very same witnesses and the very same facts with what was unsealed today.
Well, what we thought at the time was going on were a couple of things. First of all, David Pecker was very tied in at that time with Trump and his world. So David Pecker knew a lot. Not only did David Pecker know a lot, but Trump was very concerned about what David Pecker knew. And our reporting at the time had shown that that Trump wanted to get more out of David Pecker's vaults that may concern him. So the case was continuing. The investigation was continuing. What we also know, though, is that then Attorney General Barr, or he would come in as this case was ongoing, he did not love this case. So it was, and he's spoken about that. He didn't love this idea that people are talking about now about, can a campaign finance case like this really work? This idea of an in-kind contribution. So it was clear that the leadership at Justice didn't love this whole investigation. So that could have been mixed up in it, but a lot of it was shrouded to us, and that David Pecker deal was always quite fascinating. But very importantly, now is David Pecker spoke about this again in terms of helping Trump keep something quiet to help him in an election. So that is still something of great value, I would think, for this case, depending on how prosecutors make that linkage.
Yeah.
Hey, Jim. I want to go back and think about this in a slightly broader way than just the purely legal and talk a little bit about just exactly what it meant. And we're going to be now really relitigating the 2016 election again. All these old haunted these ghosts are coming out of the closet here, and we're reading about these stories. The story about the doorman and the doorman's secret is a story that was written about back in 2018. It kind of was out there, but Ronan Farrow wrote about it. Everybody all excited, and then it kind of went away. Now it's back here in the middle of this statement of facts. You know, the one thing in the covering politics for a long time, the one thing I've learned is that usually if there's a story about a presidential candidate that's dirty in some way, the National Enquirer is usually first on it. They're usually right, and that's been the case for a lot of people. They're a very dangerous outfit. They do their tabloid stuff, but when they get into it and look at the seamy side of a presidential candidate's personal life, they're often on the money. John Edwards was the most vivid example. What was it worth to Donald Trump? Given that of everybody I've ever seen run for president, people in the press corps assumed that there was more dirt on Trump than anyone. And yet we went through all of 2015 and most of 2016 without getting into any of it. Was like the whole story really about this deal between Trump and Pecker? That was what made it possible for Trump until we got to the very end of the campaign and Access Hollywood opened the doors. Was that what allowed Trump to be able to skate through, essentially, the alliance with Pecker?
I mean, that's the question. If you could go back in time and Trump were given a chance to do it all over again, would he do the same thing? Because what we've also noticed, including from the Access Hollywood tape, was this was such a pre-Trump presidency moment. It was assumed that these stories would be devastating to him. And that Access Hollywood tape, of course, was not devastating to him. These stories did break during his presidency. One of them, actually, the Wall Street Journal first got on to this whole mechanism to catch and kill and protect him before the end of the campaign. So these things weren't hurting him. But yes, there was this assumption that these kind of stories could really hobble his candidacy. I think in retrospect, that might have been wrong, but that doesn't matter. What matters to prosecutors, obviously, is what they did to try to quiet them. And the Inquirer, before this era, had indeed terrified presidential candidate after presidential candidate. Trump comes along. He has something different. He has this relationship where he's a friend of Pecker, an FOP, as they called it internally, where he could be the beneficiary of these catch and kill deals.
That's amazing. FOP is a thing.
Yes.
It's just completely amazing. You just blew my mind of all the news that happened today.
FOB, friend of Bill, was the big thing back in the Clinton era. Now you friend of Pecker, which is one of those things doesn't bear any further comment.
I have no words. I guess the only thing I would say is that I think that this is worth a conversation for all of us to have about whether this would have hurt him or not. But I think it's important to include the context that Trump thought it would.
Yes.
Which is why Trump. So that it may be true that it would not have hurt Trump. It would have been a boom, right? That dudes would have been even more psyched if they learned about the sex with a porn star. But Trump didn't think so, which is why he pays $130,000.
And yes, and Trump thought that. And I will say that one, I agree with Jim. I mean, who knows?
Who knows? I agree too.
But it's also the case that, in the early days of Trump's candidacy, when he was first running, and I mean, we've talked about this a million times, he becomes the candidate of the evangelical right. Now,
which is also
would that have happened if all of the dirty laundry was out from the very beginning of the campaign?
I mean, in hindsight, I think
I don't
yes,
know,
because
we don't know.
they're totally hypocritical and they voted for him after Access Hollywood. But in the moment, we didn't know.
Well, after Access Hollywood was the Republican nominee, and I think there are a lot of partisan loyalties. I think early on, you don't know the answer, but it is crucial to know that Trump built some very unlikely alliances in the Republican base, especially with the evangelicals, that were not taken for granted when he first ran. And he believed that at the beginning he could do all kinds of transgressions, but he wanted this deal badly. He thought it was crucial.
He wanted it paid in cash.
Right. He thought this was really important.
Jim, I hope you stay near the camera between 4 and 6. We're going to be needing you. Thank you for spending some time with us today on the breaking news. Coming up for all of us, Donald Trump lost in another court in another case today, a potentially hugely consequential ruling there. We'll tell you about it. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everybody, it's Joe Scarborough. Exciting news. You can now stream Morning Joe live on Peacock. You're going to find us in their new Morning News Live feature every weekday from 6 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Head to peacocktv.com/Morning Joe for more information. See you there.
And there's more bad news for the disgraced, twice impeached, now indicted ex-president today in another investigation. A federal appeals court has rejected Trump's bid to stop former top aides, including ex-chief of staff Mark Meadows, from testifying in DOJ's January 6th investigation. DOJ had been locked in a legal fight, a back and forth, over forcing Meadows to testify, along with others, including Trump speechwriter Stephen Miller, former Department of Homeland Security Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli, former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, and former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. It is not clear at this time if Trump's team intends to appeal the ruling. Joining the conversation, New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater, Mary McCord, Harry Litman, and John Heilemann are still here. Luke, we've talked about this a little bit. We've also analyzed what we know from these people in the somewhat limited information they shared with the congressional probe. This would be a huge deal. You and I were on together with Tim Haake, who said this group unlocks everything for special counsel Jack Smith.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary development for the grand jury investigation into January 6th. I mean, this is a group of people that, for the most part, some of them did talk to the January 6th committee, but there's quite a few on that list, including Mark Meadows, who refused to ever come in before the January 6th committee and answer questions. And we know they have just so much firsthand knowledge about the plans to overturn the 2020 election, and specifically what Donald Trump was thinking and doing at specific times. You'll recall, of course, the testimony that Mark Meadows was in and out of the Oval Office on January 6th and was involved in discussions about whether Donald Trump supported the Hang Mike Pence chant. You know, that came out in the committee hearings. This would be the first time prosecutors would ask him under oath about Donald Trump's mindset as that violence was unfolding at the Capitol, and he would have, you know, firsthand knowledge of those conversations. So it is a very big development for this investigation.
Mary McCord, it also tracks with this more opaque phase of the Jack Smith probe, where there is work going on that we don't know about, but most of the legal battles are going in DOJ's way.
Yes, this is just one of a series of rulings that we've learned about recently that have gone in the department's favor. And of course, this is one of a series of losses that Trump has had on the issues of executive privilege, right? These date back years. He's been arguing that really all of his advisors and people close to him should not be able to testify first, you know, whether it's in front of Congress or in front of a grand jury because of executive privilege. And, you know, that privilege is not absolute. It yields to a demonstrated specific need, particularly in a criminal investigation. And I think what we're seeing here is a big difference between a criminal investigation, the power of a grand jury, and a congressional investigation, where enforcing subpoenas in the face of assertions like executive privilege is much more challenging. It has been attempted and done sometimes, but it's much more challenging. But here, you know, these are things where there's case law that applies. It can be, you know, analyzed with respect to the facts in each one of these witnesses, each one of whom has something important to say, and each one, the importance of that, the demonstrated specific need for it as part of the criminal investigation is something that the Court of Appeals found persuasive.
Luke, just take me inside what our understanding is of the state of being Mark Meadows. Is he believed to be cooperating in any of these probes? Is George Terwilliger still his attorney? We heard, have they gone totally dark?
Yeah, they've been no commenting everything about all of these investigations, but my understanding is George Terwilliger is still representing him. Obviously they participated some with the January 6th committee, enough to, in the Justice Department's eyes, avoid a contempt of Congress charge. But now, this is really the big moment, because if Mark Meadows has to come in and testify, that could potentially open up the entire investigation, because when you talk to the January 6th investigators, they say he is the central person, except for Donald Trump himself, who knows everything that was going on, who was talking with all the members of Congress about the objections, was talking with the rally planners about putting on the big rally, getting all these thousands of people to come on January 6th. He was going down to Georgia. He's on the call where they try to talk to the election officials to get the results changed. Every single aspect of the January 6th plan, Mark Meadows is involved. So, yeah, could he refuse to go in before the grand jury even after a judge's order? I think he would be risking jail time if he did that. So that would be quite a development if that happened. But I would suspect he ends up now facing questions.
Alan?
I just want to pick up on something Mary just said a second ago, which is, this notion, just the whole picture of the last couple of weeks, which is the special counsel's like doing business. It's like all of a sudden it's like quietly
he's seeking this
he's cooking with gas, right?
Yeah.
It's like a lot of people were very skeptical when he was appointed. People said, oh, it's just going to cause more delay. Why do we need it? We're rewarding Trump. Those were decent arguments, right? But all of a sudden, even the skeptics of him have noticed that he's just winning on all these things. I'll also point out, look at that guy. He was an absolute doppelganger for Coach Beard on Ted Lasso. They look exactly the same. Jack Smith the Beard and Coach Beard on Ted Lasso, the same person. But that guy seems to be really about to break it all wide open.
He is pursuing these cases with alacrity. He doesn't seem to, there's no analysis that one's more important than the other. They're all full steam ahead. Absolutely.
Full steam ahead,
absolutely. Yeah. Luke Broadwater, Mary McCord, especially Harry Litman, John Heilemann, thank you all so much for being part of our conversation and our coverage on an historic day. We are grateful.
Hey everybody, it's Hoda Kotb
and Jenna Bush Hager.
And we got big news, y'all. Our show is now a podcast.
That's right. You can take us anywhere you go, in your car, to the gym, even just at home on your own couch with a glass of wine.
We like spending time with each other, and now we love that we can spend even more time with you. Are you sick of us yet?
Don't be, because you can never have to miss a moment of fun, laughs, or friendship.
Yeah, subscribe. Listen to Today with Hoda and Jenna wherever you get your podcasts.